very much. Please be seated. Okay, record, please. We are back on the record. State with Kohberger, case number CR 2922, page 405. Everybody identified previously. Still in the courtroom. And Mr. Larkin, Dr. Larkin is sitting, going to be sitting in the witness box, and you are under oath. So go ahead. Well, first, a couple of things. Number one, I'm going to overrule the objection about her foundation to be an expert. And then you were given the opportunity to look at the PowerPoint, and so where are we?
Your Honor, we began to review the PowerPoint, and it was immediately apparent to us that we would need to consult with one of our own experts. There's a lot of scientific terms, charts, graphs, etc. We simply are not prepared with this late notice to respond right now. So what we would ask the court to do, so we don't hold things up today, would be to just give us the same opportunity to reserve cross for a later time, like the other witness who was just disclosed yesterday.
Okay, ready to. Okay, so we need to come back again to have more informed cross-examination. But go ahead.
All right. Dr. Larkin, I think we are prepared to start with your PowerPoint now. That just means we might have to come back another day and there might be more questions for you. Are you ready?
Yes.
PowerPoint? All right. I can screen share. There we go. Okay. We are participating in this now. All right. Dr. Larkin, we are going to be talking about genetic genealogy first and how it works. So I'm going to give us to the first slide with that and ask you a question.
I think you need to hit play.
If I hit play, then
Show presentation.
clearly we should have had somebody besides
We need another expert.
you. Fine. Yes, we need another expert. I think we're ready now.
Yes.
Now, are we going to talk about how genetic genealogy works? If I do it correctly.
Yes. Tell me what kind of DNA genetic genealogy exists.
Okay, so DNA is just DNA, but there are a few different inheritance patterns for DNA. So there is mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome DNA, and then what we call autosomal DNA. And those are the main types that we need to
Could you just have that spelled for the court reporter?
autosomal, AUTOSOMAL.
What is
All three.
Okay,
Yeah, sorry.
mitochondrial, 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 and then Y chromosome is, it's just letter Y, and then chromosome CHROMOSOME.
Okay, thank you.
What is autosomal DNA?
So autosomal DNA is inherited from both of your parents, all 4 of your grandparents, all 8 of your great-grandparents, and so on. That's a little bit different from mitochondrial and Y chromosome. Mitochondrial you only get from your mother, so it just tracks that direct maternal line. Y chromosome DNA is only in chromosomal males, and it goes from father to son, so it tracks the direct paternal line. But autosomal DNA can show relationships on all branches of your tree because you inherit it from all of your grandparents and so on.
As a genetic genealogist, do you use one over the other when you do this?
I primarily use autosomal DNA. Mitochondrial DNA does not change very rapidly, so it doesn't give you a really good sense of how closely related you might be to someone. Y chromosome DNA is it changes a little bit more rapidly than mitochondrial DNA, but it's still fairly slow. You could have a match to someone and your connection to them could be back in the 1700s. So it's not going to tell you, who your immediate relatives are. Autosomal DNA can give you I call it kind of depth perception. It can give you a much better sense of how far back in time your connection to that other person is. And that's what's primarily used for adoptee searches. It's what's primarily used in the forensic area as well. So that's just showing the inheritance patterns of the DNA.
Does the autosomal DNA, does that provide more matches so that you can do your work easier?
Yes.
How does this happen? How do you get to do your work?
Okay, so if you're just a regular old genealogist, you will purchase a DNA kit from one of the main testing companies. They will send you a little tube, and you either spit in the tube, and it seems like a lot of spit, or you do a cheek swab. You put that back in the tube, and you mail it back to the company. The company will then extract the DNA and do the analysis on it.
As the genetic genealogist, or the person who did the test, what do you get? How do you know when something happens?
Right, when your results are finished, they'll send you an email, and you can then log into the website. And once you do that, you will see all of the companies offer what they call ethnicity estimates, and so it will tell you, whether you're descended from, German stock or Scottish or African or whatever your sort of broader ethnic background is. They will give you a list of matches, which are other people who've taken the same DNA test in the same database and who share DNA with you. So that's the 2 main things that you get from that.
So the same database, what do you mean by that?
So there are multiple companies that offer these services. So the 2 biggest ones are Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. So for example, if I tested Ancestry and my sister tested 23andMe, we won't get matched to one another because we're not in the same database.
Where you test is specific to where you're going to find who you're related to.
Right.
Okay. All right. You, as a genetic genealogist, did cases referred to you?
Yes.
Okay. And so how do you get into these databases?
So at Ancestry DNA, there is a sharing system. So the person who's taken the test can essentially authorize me or invite me to view their DNA results, and then I can do that in my own account. I never have to log into their account. At the other services, with the exception of GEDmatch, which we haven't gotten to yet, I would have to log into their accounts to see their DNA matches.
You mentioned that, you're backing up a little bit, but you mentioned that you can find out a lot about your ancestry, meaning kind of where you come from. What other kinds of information can you find out?
So, for example, at 23andMe, they offer health reports and trait reports based on your DNA that can tell you if you have a higher than average likelihood of developing certain cancers or certain diseases. They can tell you things that are kind of silly, like do you like cilantro, or if you're prone to drinking more caffeine than the average or less. But they can tell all of those things from the DNA test that they've done on them.
And that's only one of the databases that offer that much information.
23andMe does, and then there's a third-party site called Prometheus that you can take your data file and upload it there, and it will run these reports on you. Prometheus, Promethease, and if I got that wrong, it's not because I'm lying.
You changed slides, and now I have the slide that says microwave. What is that?
So a microwave is the actual piece of lab material that we use to run this test. It was designed, so microwaves were designed for biomedical research. They're designed for scientific research. And unlike the STRs that you use for POTUS, microarrays pretty much scan your entire genome. They're looking at, so we talked about autosomal DNA. They look at about 600,000 individual bits of your autosomal DNA. Those are called single nucleotide polymorphisms. So NUCLDOTIDE and then POLYMORPHISM. I feel like I'm in a spelling bee. These are individual bits of DNA that are known to vary among people. Most of our DNA is identical, so looking at those bits are not going to tell you who's related to whom. They look at these microarrays specifically target the chunks of DNA that we know vary between or among individuals. And so that uses higher levels of DNA than you typically have for forensic purposes.
Do you mean more like when you talk about spitting the tumor swabbing the tube, I mean you have to have a lot of it to do this?
You have to have a fair amount of DNA to do a microarray.
What happens if you don't?
Then there is an alternative. There's an alternative method called whole genome sequencing, and then this is there's whole genome sequencing, and the specific way they go about it is called next generation sequencing. And that will actually work on lower levels of DNA. It will work on lower quality DNA, so DNA that might have been broken down because it's been exposed to the elements for a while. That will work better on DNA that's contaminated. So it might have bacterial DNA in it, or fungal DNA in it. So that is an alternative approach to microarrays, but it's more labor intensive and it's more expensive.
So you need a microarray or this other way that's more expensive and sounds like more issues with to get to something that you can put in the computer and find out who you're doing.
Yes.
What is this?
So this is just kind of a teaching strategy just to show that we have 2 parents or grandparents. 8 great-grandparents have color-coded the grandparent lines to help us track how the matches fit in.
And when you do autosomal DNA, it's this group of people that you're drawing.
Those are the people who contributed the DNA in you, yes.
What do we have here?
So this is an outline showing how some of your DNA matches might fit into your tree. So you may have some second cousins or first cousins once removed or second cousins once removed who also took the DNA test and are in the same database as you, and they would share DNA with you and would be listed in your matches. And you can see in this diagram, I'm only showing 2 great-grandparent lines. There are actually 4. If the diagram gets too messy if I try to add more. So the thing is, when you get these matches, the DNA company doesn't actually know how you're related to them. It just knows how much DNA you share with them. And so the DNA company is not going to tell you, this is your second cousin. It's just going to say this person shares so much DNA with you, and they could be your second cousin, but they might could be something else. And then it's up to the genealogist to essentially reverse engineer the tree based on the DNA matches.
do you do that when you have to find out who this person is based on these various matches in different places?
Right.
Do you have experience as a genetic genealogist doing that, where you don't know who this person is, you've got to identify this person based on their kit?
Yes.
So what do you do?
So you will get a list of DNA matches from your testing company. And they are sorted, that list is sorted by how much DNA they share with you. So it's not necessarily sorted by how closely related those people are to you. You get this list, and sometimes they use their real names, the people in the list. Sometimes they use an alias. Depending on the database, you may or may not be able to see their email address. And some of them will have their own family trees linked to their DNA results because they're doing the same thing you are. They're trying to research their family trees. A lot of them won't. And for the people who don't, you have to try to figure out who they are, who their parents are, who their grandparents are, and build trees for them.
Time-consuming process.
It is time-consuming.
You talk to us about shared DNA.
Yes.
That it doesn't tell you how closely related some of this.
Right, so we measure autosomal DNA in a unit called centimorgans, centimorgans. The more centimorgans you share with someone, on average, the more closely you are related, but it's possible, for example, there's a range for most of these relationships. So it's actually possible that you could have a full first cousin who shares less DNA with you than a half first cousin. And that's one of the things that complicates the work of a genetic genealogist. We only have an approximate relationship from the centimorgan amount, not a hard and fast, this is definitely so-and-so relationship.
In your work, when you have your unidentified person, and if you put the profile in and receive matches in various places, you're looking at these centimorgans to try to get a clue. What do you do after you have this information that tells you about centimorgans?
So I have to essentially build trees for these matches. The first step in the process is to figure out how they are related to one another. Before I can figure out, for example, if I'm trying to help an adoptee find their biological parents. To figure out how they are related to their matches, first I have to figure out how the matches are related to one another. And then I kind of reverse engineer where my adoptee will fit into that family tree based on the DNA results.
What does that say?
So we mentioned earlier one of the tools that I helped to develop for analyzing DNA results. This is a set of screenshots from this shared centimorgan tool. It's also sometimes called the shared centimorgan project tool. That's too many syllables. So what you do is you will type in the centimorgan amount for one of your matches. On the previous slide, the top match was 72 centimorgans. So if I were working that case, I would type in 72 centimorgans into this tool, and you get the diagram there where the possible relationships are highlighted. So your person of interest is your adoptee. In this tool, will highlight the possible relationships for a 72 centimorgan match. And if you count up all of the little highlighted boxes on there, there are 30 or 35 possible relationships for somebody who shares 72 centimorgans. And so this is sorry, I'm not supposed to talk.
What, I don't know what the statistic that just popped up is about. What is that?
Okay, so I mentioned that this is a statistical tool that's using probabilities. And so even though there are 30 or 35 possible relationships for a 72 centimorgan match, some of them are more likely statistically than others. And so this panel that is in that tool is listing which of the relationships are most likely. And so there are a group of relationships with, I can't quite read that from here, but I think it says half their cousins, That's the most likely group, and then below that, I think it's third cousins, that's the next most likely group, and it has the genealogist. That tells me that I'm gonna need to build this person's tree back, probably to second great grandparent level, before I can conceivably figure out where my person of interest fits into that tree.
Is that important to know how far back you have to build that tree?
You have to find the connections among the matches, and you sort of need to know where in the tree to look for that.
I think you told us you have to build trees for each of the matches so that you can find those connectors.
Yes, and I have to build out both sides of a matches tree because I don't know if my person of interest is going to be related on their mother's side or on their father's side. I don't know which grandparent it's through. So I essentially have to build the whole tree back several generations to find the connections.
Are these decisions that you as the genetic genealogist have to make to do your work finding the matches?
Yes, but I have to continue to build trees things.
Now, do you have to build trees for all of those 35 matches? Or do you do it until you kind of figure out these are the common people?
There are some matches that I may not be able to build trees for. Maybe I can't figure out who they are. So on this slide, there's only 5 matches shown, and if you click, only 2 of the people of that 5 have posted their own trees. That little icon that I'm pointing the arrows at show that those 2 matches have built their own trees. And so that saves me a lot of work because I can look at their tree, and rather than having to build it from scratch, I can, they've listed their parents and their grandparents, and I can just go ahead and double check to make sure that they put the right people down, rather than having to build the trees from scratch. The other people, I either have to build their trees from scratch if I can figure out who they are, or sometimes I may just have to skip them if they have a really common name and I don't know where they live or what their age is. I may, if it's a John Smith, I may never be able to figure out who they are and build out a tree for them because there are thousands of John Smiths.
I think this graphic shows us the process and how far you have to build trees for the matches and try to identify the one person. Did I understand that right?
Yes, this is just a simple example where I've built out 2 hypothetical trees for 2 hypothetical matches. In which case, in this example, I've gone out to the first great grandparents.
And what are you looking for?
I'm looking for connections between match. So match 1 is on the left, match 2 is on the right. I'm looking for commonalities between their 2 trees. I want to see how match 1 and match 2 are related to one another. And so in this case, I've identified, and this is hypothetical, of course, that John Smith and Mary Jones married and had children, and they were the great grandparents of the person on the left tree. And John Smith and Mary Jones were also the great grandparents of the match on the right. So now I know that match 1 and match 2 are second cousins to one another. That's kind of the first hook that I have into trying to figure out how my person of interest fits into that tree. And so I would then diagram.
What do you do from there?
Yes, thank you, sorry. I would then start building what I call a descendant diagram, and I will do this in a sketching software. So I have John Smith and Mary Jones, and I've listed their 2 children and their grandchildren. Then I put the DNA matches in there so I can see how the matches are related to one another.
Let me see if I understand this. You took matches to your unknown person and then built their trees out and found great grandparents or the same great grandparents
Yes.
for both these other matches to be unknown. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And then you took that match and started figuring out who their kids were, and then you said their kids had kids. Is that what we're seeing here?
Right, and so what I'm looking for now, so I found these 2, match 1 and match 2, who are second cousins to one another. What I'm looking for now are ways to integrate more DNA matches
Okay.
into that tree that I've just got my hook on.
Why didn't you want to do that?
Because the more DNA matches I have, the stronger my statistical analysis for where my person of interest fits into that tree.
How do you?
So if I'm working an adoptee case, my goal is to get my adoptee into as many databases as possible. I always call them tested ancestry because that's the biggest database. Then 23andMe because it's the second biggest. And then my heritage is the next in size. And so I want to get them into all of these databases because I can do this. I can build this tree using some matches from Ancestry and some matches from 23 and some from my heritage. And again, I'm doing this so that I have as much statistical data as possible when I try to place my person of interest into that tree.
And that's when you have somebody who's doing their own DNA testing and then sharing their profile with you so you can build a tree out to try to identify who their biological is. I think I got we'll go to the next slide. It looks like you replaced the people, the matches, with numbers. What's
Yes.
going on here?
Those may be hard to see, but in this case, I'm showing an example listing the centimorgan amounts to the various DNA matches that I've managed to place into this tree.
In this one, you have a whole new red line we didn't have before. How did you figure it out?
So this is a hypothesis. It's an educated guess about where my person of interest might fit into that tree based on how much DNA they share with those 5 matches that I could document. And it might be right, it might be wrong. It's just an educated guess. It's a way to guide my next step in the research.
What is it?
My next step in the research, at this point, might need to dig into another database and see if I can find more matches. I would run the what are the odds analysis tool to see what other hypotheses might fit.
You want to tell me about the what are the odds tool now?
Sure, I can. That's a different slide. So this is the what are the odds tool. You basically build the descendant diagram that was on the previous slide, but into this tool. You enter the centimorgan amounts, so that's the measure of shared DNA. You enter the centimorgan amounts into the WATO tool. Sorry, we call it WATO for short, W-A-T-O. So you enter the centimorgan amounts where those individual DNA matches fit into the tree, and then you can ask the tool to suggest possible hypotheses for you. And that's what those teal boxes are. Those teal boxes are places where the tool is saying your person of interest could fit into this tree in this spot based on the DNA matches.
This tool tells you kind of where to look.
Yes.
In that line. What do you do from there?
So from here, there are several hypotheses there. If you could go back to the previous slide. Thank you. There are several hypotheses there. So what I want to do, and each one of them is going to have a score. And so what I want to do is focus on the hypotheses that have the highest scores, because those are the ones that are most likely. And I might investigate whether, if I'm looking for a birth father, was he in the right place at the time of conception, or was he serving overseas? If he was serving overseas, then I rule him out. I might reach out to members of his family and ask them to do a DNA test for me, because then I can add their DNA match to this analysis and sort of slowly over time focus in on my most likely candidate, for example, if it's the birth father.
Does that mean you reach out to just the regular people that haven't chosen to do this and see if they voluntarily want to put their DNA in to help build a family tree?
Yes, at times I will do that.
I think we're ready for this slide. Yeah. I'm kind of showing you that.
Okay, so it's the same tree, but I'm showing a different scenario in which the DNA matches were lower. They shared less DNA. This is just another hypothetical example to show how the probabilities and the suggested hypotheses will change depending on how much DNA those matches shared with you in the first place.
Does that make your work more complicated?
It does. The lower the DNA matches, the harder it is to actually find what you're looking for.
Is strategic testing, and you're talking about here, is that what you mean when you say something you have to ask people to test?
Yes, some genealogists call it target testing, some call it strategic testing. You're essentially reaching out to people who haven't tested yet and asking them, hey, I want to do a genealogy test for me. And you're doing that to help narrow down the connections.
This one has some arrows pointing us in the direction. What's going on?
Right, I'm afraid you can't see the scores on that tree because it's kind of small. But those arrows are pointing at the hypotheses in this tree that have the highest scores. So that's where I would try to target relatives who might be willing to do a DNA test for me.
And those scores come from the tool.
Those come from the tool and they're,
And those give you, I guess, information about which direction's more likely.
yeah, the probabilities are based on the shared centimorgan amounts.
We're going to shift and talk about forensic genetic genealogy. Tell us what you mean by that.
So forensic is basically pertinent to any sort of legal proceeding or court case, not a lawyer. So if I got that wrong. But in this case, sometimes so the Department of Justice calls this work forensic genetic genealogy. A lot of practitioners call it investigative genetic genealogy, but it's the same thing.
Does that mean it's work that's done for law enforcement?
It's work that's done for law enforcement, and it's also done, oftentimes I think the client might actually be a medical examiner if you're dealing with an unknown human remains.
Do you do that kind of work?
I do not.
Have you been taught about that?
I have learned a bit about it, yes.
How have you learned it?
I've learned about it by communicating with practitioners who do it, and also by attending conferences and watching recorded videos.
Did you do it if you wanted to?
Yes.
There's no other qualifications you need other than what you have right
No, not at the moment.
now. The slide talks about the kind and quality of DNA. What kind of DNA is needed for forensic DNA? What kind of DNA?
So you can use any type of DNA the same as you would use for regular genealogy. You could do mitochondrial, you could do Y chromosome, you could do autosomal, and as I mentioned before, most of this work is using autosomal DNA. And the difference is that if somebody's spitting in a tube, they're providing a lot of DNA, and they're providing clean DNA, and they're providing DNA that gets preserved with the fluid to keep it from breaking down. And that's not always the situation that you're going to find at either crime scenes or if you're dealing with unknown human remains.
I know we talked about the microarray a while ago, and that there was another way to get this profile to do your work.
Yes,
Is that where we're going?
that's where we're going.
Tell me about that.
Okay,
Exactly.
so next generation genome sequencing is a technique that you can use to analyze the entire human genome. You're not just focusing on the 600 or 700,000 bits that the genealogy company uses. You're trying to sequence the whole thing. And that can sometimes work when there's not enough DNA for a microarray.
How is that done?
It's hard to explain. So I'm using this graphic to try to explain it. So imagine that the solid red line at the top is the entire genome that we're trying to analyze. Next genome sequencing actually focuses on little subsets, and it's kind of like skimming a document. So if you skim a document, you're not reading every single word. Next generation sequencing is not trying to read every single little bit of DNA along the way. Instead, it's skimming little bits, and it's missing a lot on the first skim. And then it skims it again, and it will miss some on the second skim, but it might pick up bits it didn't pick up the first time. And so it keeps skimming the DNA. And after the analysis is done, you can kind of reconstruct from the little snippets that you skimmed along the way, and you can post the next gap. So these are the portions in gray that were skimmed in the multiple episodes, and those are called reads in the next generation sequencing process. The more reads you do, the more of the genome you can reconstruct, and the more confident you can be that you did it correctly. Because sometimes if you're skimming a word, you might, the word might be there and you read there because you are reading too fast, right? So the more times you skim an individual piece of DNA, the more confident you can be that it was called accurately.
Is there a number of times that's best practice to skim?
So for medical research, for biomedical research, the companies who sell this equipment recommend that you do 30 times. They call it a 30 times coverage to get a confident read. Oftentimes in forensic work, they're not able to get 30x reads, and so they're working with fewer skimming. And that skimming is not a technical term. I'm just using the analogy to teach this.
Talk about missing information when you skim. This slide says that it's filled in by a word called indication. Is that
Yes.
what this slide means?
So if you can't do 30x coverage of the genome, which is often the case when you're working with low quantities of DNA or contaminated DNA, you won't get the whole genome. There'll be missing pieces. This is a stage of the process called bioinformatics. And you actually have a specialist who goes in and uses statistical methods to try to fill in the pieces that were missing in the initial analysis.
Does that mean that person's projecting what would be there? Is that showing us that?
That's showing us the parts that were imputed. That's the term that we would use.
All right, once you have this information, after bioinformatics has added their details, then what happens?
So recall that the next generation sequencing is analyzing the entire genome. But the genealogy companies, the matching databases, are not interested in the entire genome. They're not going to analyze the whole genome. They only want the SNPs, so the SNPs, that were analyzed by the microarray. So now the bioinformatician has to go in and essentially delete a whole bunch of the whole genome data so that they're only left with the portions that would have been on a microarray had they been microarrayed in the first place.
This happens after they're filled in to make a whole, then they're stripped back to make it usable.
Yes.
By genetic genealogy database. How do you know if you're not just left with all of those filled in things?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
So when these are stripped back out so that they're usable, so they become an SNP, it's usable. This is after the imputation.
Right.
How do you know what is left?
How do you know which parts were imputed and which parts were from the next generation sequencing?
Yes.
The bioinformatician would have access to that data, but as a genealogist, you wouldn't know.
Okay. That question will be for somebody different.
That would be for someone different.
After the SNP is created, then
So then you have a file that would look just like what you could get from one of the actual genealogy testing companies, and you can upload that. If it's a forensic kit for forensic purposes, you can upload that to two main databases. One of them is called Family Tree DNA, which in the trade we generally just call FTDNA, and the other one is GenMatch. And there are a couple of smaller databases, but they're really tiny.
you can go to Ancestry.
No. Ancestry will not let you upload a file into the database, nor will one bring.
They have to
There's
do
no
their own
process to do it. The only way to get into those two databases is by spinning it.
All right, on this slide, does this represent most of these companies that do the genetic analysis?
Those are all of the main companies. There are a few smaller ones, but they're really quite tiny, and often for those, we don't even have decent estimates of how large they are.
By large, do you mean the number of people that have uploaded a profile or spin in a tube, so one's created?
Yes.
There. Okay. And I think you let us know that law enforcement uses and can only use GEDmatch and family tree DNA.
Per the terms of service of the companies, they are only allowed to use family tree DNA and GEDmatch, and there are two smaller dedicated databases. One of them is called DNA Justice, which has, as of yesterday, about 500 people in it. And the other one is DNA Solves, which is owned by Optum, and I have no idea how many people are in it.
Those two that you just talked about, can anybody use those, or are those only law enforcement can use those?
DNA Solves and Optum.
Yes.
Yes, those are only for law enforcement. A regular genealogist wouldn't have access to any output from those. You can voluntarily contribute your DNA, but then you can't use it for your own genealogy.
And GEDmatch and family tree DNA, are those law enforcement only, or are those usable by others?
Those are usable by regular genealogists, and both of them existed long before the field of forensic genealogy did.
But they also allow.
They both allow law enforcement to upload the kits, the DNA kits, into their databases.
My heritage, I don't think we've talked a ton about that. I understand Ancestry and 23andMe, you have to give your own sample, they do their own thing. But my heritage, how do you have to do the fitness proof for that?
No, so MyHeritage sells DNA tests, as does Family Tree DNA. So you can send a kit in. Those are cheek swabs, they're not stick. That's technical. But for both MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA, you could test directly with them, but you could also take your data file from one of the other companies and just upload the file. And it's just a text file that has thousands and thousands of lines of DNA data.
So as a genetic genealogist, you are working with somebody and you can take their profile that was made at 23andMe and put it in MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA.
Yes.
And you also put it in GEDmatch.
Yes.
And law enforcement can only search Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. Can they search your person?
If there's a DNA match to my person, they will see that match.
Okay. Does your person have to agree, law enforcement, to let that happen?
If we're talking about my adoptee, so it's complicated because the rules have changed continually over the past few years. As it currently stands at GEDmatch, if we were to take a brand new kit, a brand new adoptee client, and upload their data to GEDmatch, we would have to consent. The client would have to either consent or decline to consent to participate in law enforcement matching.
If they decline to participate and law enforcement searches GEDmatch, then they should not see your clients. Is that
They
right?
should not see my clients.
Okay. Same with Family Tree DNA?
Family Tree DNA, the system is kind of the inverse. If you add a kit to Family Tree DNA, they automatically opt you in. There is a way to opt yourself out, but you kind of have to know where to find it. It's not obvious.
Again, a person can keep their information private, so it doesn't wind up in law enforcement searches.
They
in
can, yes.
Family Tree DNA. And MyHeritage is different, law enforcement shouldn't upload.
MyHeritage explicitly prohibits it.
Did I just ask you all questions that related to the arrows?
No, so the database, the total database at Family Tree DNA and the total database at GEDmatch are both larger than the number of people who opted in. So not everyone at Family Tree DNA has opted in to law enforcement matching. Not everyone at GEDmatch has opted in to law enforcement matching. And so the arrows are the gray bars are showing my estimates, and these are my personal estimates for the number of people in each of those databases who are officially accessible to law enforcement for matching.
And that's because those companies out at 2 categories of.
Yes.
I think we're now to the last section where we're gonna talk about the work products of genetic genealogy. What does that topic mean?
So these are if I have an adopted client, this is what I would give the client at the end of our agreement. These are the products that I would give them, and in basically everybody who's doing forensic genetic genealogy that I know of, except possibly the FBI, originally trained as a genetic genealogist. So this is what we are all used to giving to our clients.
What are we seeing on this first slide that you did to your clients?
Okay, so those are 2 of the match lists. The one on the left is what a typical match list looks like at GEDmatch. The one on the right is what a typical match list looks like at Family Tree DNA. For my clients, I will actually screenshot the matches and put that in the appendix to my report. I also copy all of the matches into another program because sometimes people will, they'll be in the match list of my adoptee and then they'll disappear. And so I like to have a record that, hey, when I uploaded this kit, I had these matches there. So even if they decide to delete their kit later, I still have a record that they shared so and so much DNA with my client.
This is like a family tree.
It does look like a family tree, and it's anonymized. There are no real.
Dr. Larkin, what are we seeing on this family tree?
So this is the family tree that I would have built for my client. And this would have attached to it documentation, so birth and death records. It would have census records if I was able to find the family, the census, immigration records, any sort of documentation that I might find. I often will link obituaries if I find them, if I find family photos. A lot of times you might find articles in the newspaper, and I will link everything that I find to this family tree that I then give the client.
Does that help verify for your client that the results you gave them were accurate?
Yes, it helps verify that all of the relationships that I'm reporting to them are documented and yeah.
And it looks like you give them a copy of the descendant diagram.
I
did.
I do.
And you give them a copy of the what are the odds
I do.
and a written report.
I do. If the client requests it, I will write a report for them.
Other than those things that you give your clients, what would be available on the forensic side of the genetic genealogy?
Right, so they should have the original DNA data file, whether it was a microarray or the next generation sequencing. I don't need to give that to my client because they had that with them. There are some complications when you're dealing with forensic DNA because I didn't have a person spit a whole bunch of DNA into a tube. Sometimes you might have a mixture where more than one person is represented in the sample. So that needs to be analyzed, and there presumably would be documentation associated with that analysis, which is called deconvolution, DECONVOLUTION. If there was not, if there was non-human DNA contamination mixed in with the sample, sometimes, and not always, sometimes they will do what is called enrichment, where they're trying to increase the proportion of DNA that is human in that sample. If that process was done at the lab, there should be a record of it. the bioinformatics that we talked about, so imputing any missing data and then stripping out all of the non-genealogical DNA points, all of those there should be records of.
Oh, I think you have logins or kit numbers.
Right, so when you have, once you've gone through all these steps, you've done what we call the wet lab work, where you're actually working with the samples, and then you've done the computer analyses, you end up with the output file that mimics, it's like a fake microarray file, right? So it mimics the data that we would have gotten from a genealogy company. GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA both charge law enforcement to use their database, and so there should be some sort of contractual agreement or receipts that you paid the company for the upload. And then there are logins, because for you to be able to see the matches, you have to log into that account. You have to have access. You have at Family Tree DNA, you have to log into that specific account. At GEDmatch, I believe you can give access to a few different researchers, but they have to know what's called a kit number, which is the unique identifying number for that kit.
When you said a fake microarray, it reminded me that when we talked about microarrays, you told us that those contain a ton of personal medical information.
Yes.
This also has all that?
Yes.
And do you, because there's so many more, I guess, people or kids or profiles in my heritage, is that a place that somebody that can find a match might want to go?
Yes.
Dr. Larkin, thank you. I don't have any other questions, but don't leave quite yet. I'll pass it to your mic.
Thank you. Any cross-examination? Okay, thank you. All right, may this witness be excused?
Yes.
Okay, so you're excused. You can stay here if you like, or you can get on with your life. Thank you. It's very educational. Well, it's 1 o'clock. I think it's a good time to break, maybe until 2. How much longer do you think?
Your Honor, I have 2 additional witnesses. I believe Dr. Larkin was going to be by far the longest witness. I think the next 2 will be, I would hope, not more than an hour combining. Maybe not even take that long. And then argument, Your Honor, and know we're going to take up the state's second order of that.
Sure. Okay, great. We'll reconvene at 2 o'clock. Thank you.